everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics. Today, this is Joe Moore, coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Amanda Holley. Amanda, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited. So, we connected a couple months back and had a really interesting phone call about procedure at the FDA. And today we're recording on June 6th, which is the day after, or 2 days after, the FDA made some suggestions internally about which way to rule on the MAPS thing. But before we dig into all that, can you tell us a little bit about your background and the work you were doing at the FDA?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was raised as an academic scientist for a really long time. So, I did the traditional route of, bachelor's, master's, PhD. And then I did 2 postdocs, one in toxicology and one in pharmacology.
Couldn't get enough.
Couldn't. I really did love academic research, but I did not love academia.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately I left because I thought it was, unfortunately my experience was a little bit toxic. So I went to the FDA. I was already in the Baltimore, DC area, so it was a really great jump. And I had a background in pharmacology and toxicology. So traditionally, when you would get hired at the FDA, previously you needed the coursework to back up becoming a pharmacologist or toxicologist. The Cures Act expanded that. So now you can be hired into those roles based off of your experience. So that's how I landed the position. When I was at the FDA, I was a non-clinical reviewer. So
Mm-hmm.
basically just what that is I specialized in the front end of things. So the animal work that goes into drug development. And I worked in the division of analgesics, addiction, and pain products. So we handled opiates, other analgesics, drugs to combat addiction, and medical cannabis. So a lot of the psychedelic products we got were under the indication of treating addictions.
Beautiful. And so you were able to see some of this psychedelic stuff come through. Is that right?
Yeah. So even though when you're on a team like that, you all handle, all of the different products to gain experience and have a diverse portfolio, they do want you to pick a niche and specialize. So at the time, nobody had really taken ownership of the psychedelics. Like everybody was kind of just, you get a psilocybin. It was like Oprah with the psilocybins. But I had a existing interest in psychedelics and, understood the history and the background. And that was something that I had researched on my own time and had personal experience with. So I was like, I'll take them. And who doesn't really want to position themselves between like the federal government and psychedelics? So, but it didn't
That's
feel that way
interesting.
at all. It was honestly, it felt like such a beautiful place to be in with, the resurgence of psychedelics. I felt like I was in a good place from knowing, the history, the background of the community, where the community stands. I did attend a lot of the conferences that you guys had put on, just to kind of listen to the thoughts, feelings, and just general vibes from the community. And I tried to use that to branch it into my work at the FDA.
Brilliant. So what was it like when they first proposed that you work on a psilocybin project or a psychedelic project? Was it like a shock or like, okay, this is really happening?
Oh, I was so excited. I got my first psilocybin project. And then, I expressed interest to my supervisor and was like, if nobody has these, like if nobody's kind of taking ownership over those, I would love to. And the FDA really encourages that because it maintains consistency. You're an expert. You ultimately inform your team. And then when you have like the broader group meetings that are multidisciplinary, you're bringing the same expertise, the same knowledge, and you're able to build on that instead of just one-offs with, you might not be an expert in psilocybin, but you have this one. So it just helps decrease like redundant issues, and we can kind of move forward in a better way.
Right on. Was there any kind of expectancy of like privacy, confidentiality as you were working through these? I assume INDs is the term of art.
Yeah. So, the MDMA product that was discussed the other day from Lykos, that's an NDA. So you start as an IND, and then if you're,
Investigational new drug.
yeah. So that's a lot of your grunt work. So a lot of the non-clinical studies that are required, you're going to do those, all of your chemical manufacturing, all of that goes into it. You're setting up those studies to mirror your clinical plan. So clinical is involved, and you start your clinical trials. And then once you have all of the data, and there's more disciplines than that, then you move into the NDA phase. So it takes a lot of money and a long time.
Right. Yeah. So privacy makes a lot of sense there.
And we do have, we have our security clearance, and of course, we can't talk about anything proprietary. Um, that's also for the sponsor. So when people come in, even the data that they submit. So say there's a psilocybin product, say that's further along than the others, and they have like all of the toxicology data, and you want to leverage that for your own application. If you're using the same product, you would still need to get the rights of reference from them. And even with that, you're not allowed to see what they have in the system. You're just relying on the fact that it could support you, but the FDA can come back and say that it actually doesn't. So,
That's interesting. Okay. So, what are some, like, what would you say is like the top one or two misconceptions about this kind of work at the FDA around psychedelics specifically?
yeah, I mean, I think this one broadly applies in general, but with psychedelics in general. Even a lot of people who work as regulators on the drug development side of things, if you haven't worked in the agency, um, you don't really understand the agency. You don't understand necessarily like why they're saying what they're saying. Um, and I think particularly with psychedelics, because there, is such a horrible history between the government and the psychedelic community, that there's this level of distrust, which is fair. And, the agency is,
Does that feel both ways?
no, I didn't get the sense from the agency that there was never any conversations of like, it was more a conversation about wanting to learn and wanting, like, being accepting of data. They're a driven agency. I think because they are a government agency, people, and they are part of the executive branch, people think government, they think political, but the FDA is anything but. It didn't feel that way at all. We're not allowed to discuss politics. We're not allowed to represent our own political beliefs at all. Um, and the decisions that were made were not a political discussion. It was always data driven, evidence driven, research driven, what's needed to prove the safety of this product. The FDA is just a group of scientists who really, really care about the safety of products.
Mm, interesting. Cool. Thanks for that. And I was in a fun argument with somebody a year or two ago about FDA. I was learning a lot in this conversation, and one of the biggest things was you just nailed it: safety over potentially efficacy. Could you speak to that kind of like balance of safety over or and how it relates to efficacy inside the FDA's worldview?
Yeah, so everything that the FDA does is like a risk benefit analysis. It's a very conservative agency, I will say, at least in my experience, which, we want it to be that way ultimately. We want our medications to be safe. We want to understand the risks. We want to understand, the contraindications, how it could affect multiple populations. So we want them to be conservative. Um, if there is a dire need and there's not um, like a lot of drugs to treat something, that's taken into consideration. or if something is, very deadly, like cancer, they have a different toxicological profile that's allowed for drugs to treat cancer than for drugs that don't treat cancer. Um, because, that is actively like killing you and it needs an aggressive course of treatment. I didn't handle cancer drugs, so I can't speak to their personal criteria, but I know that, if somebody was trying to leverage data from a cancer drug for something that we were handling, it wouldn't be sufficient because it's just a different bar.
Mm-hmm. That's super interesting. Okay, so it's cost benefit analysis, and are there any like fair analogies for people to like kind of get that a little further, or examples beyond cancer?
Um, like, what do you mean? Sorry.
So just an example of that cost benefit analysis in action. So like, oh, cool, like somebody might get really thirsty and drink too much water, and that could pose a risk after that. Like, but maybe that's an acceptable risk given how much suicidality is out there. And obviously, veiledly, in a very barely veiled way, speaking to MDMA here.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, the suicidal ideology was something that popped out to me in that discussion. Yeah, I mean, so if there's we have a lot of seminars on rare diseases. So, you know, those drugs are probably going to be looked at through a different lens. If there's nothing to treat an illness, we might have to make concessions. And, that obviously would need to be disclosed to patients and all of that. I'm trying to think of better examples, but I'm kind of drawing a blank right now of how to
Yeah,
explain this.
all good. We can get into MDMA if I think it's a nice transition. So, how do we describe this process? All right, so we had the ICER thing. There's a group funded by insurance companies that provides some sort of guidance. Again, funded by insurance companies
Mm-hmm.
to the FDA, which is, I think a helpful thing for the insurance companies to have a say. And what was this thing that happened the other day? This hearing, was it?
Yeah, it's an advisory panel that looks through the available data and ultimately gives their opinion. They're a panel of experts that have been vetted presumably by the agency. I never sat on an advisory committee, but the vaccine ones were out when I was at the agency, so I did listen to those. So basically they give their talks, they highlight some of the issues. The FDA is not beholden to their decision. It's just how they're feeling. But I think it's important to understand also that like we have not had a new treatment for PTSD in decades, over a decade, about a decade.
I think the best option's Lexapro, and Lexapro is, uh, I suppose, kind of effective for some people, but not an awesome drug.
Yeah. Um so I think that this will inform the FDA, and I think I can't speak to their decision. I should also say, just give the previous Fed disclaimer that I don't represent the agency. So everything I'm saying is my interpretation and thoughts based on my experience. But yeah, it was not the outcome that I would have thought or that any of us probably really hoped for. It seemed maybe like there was a lack of understanding from the advisory committee a little bit. I will say that the design of the clinical trials was not very strong. Um, and that was, I think, the biggest piece. And that's not Lykos' fault. When you're a pioneer in something and you're the first, the FDA is learning at the same pace that the companies are. So, people in the community and who are developing psychedelics probably know more than the FDA. So ultimately, it's the headache right now is that it's kind of going to be a partnership where the FDA has to figure out the bar for safety and what these studies need to look like. And the guidance that came out is going to somewhat rapidly evolve as more products come on the market. But I think one of the biggest issues that popped out from that guidance is, a lot of these programs are psychedelic assisted therapy. And to really just look at the efficacy of the drug. So it's not saying that they're going to say like no therapy or, you know what I mean? But to just see what the drug does, they're having a hard time disentangling the contribution of therapy versus just MDMA. So in this trial, what they would have liked to see is a factorial design, which had the therapy with the drug, an arm with the drug alone, and an arm with therapy alone. That would have given them a more holistic view of the data. I think that was one of the main driving points that came up
Yeah,
for
that's fair.
like,
So there's two things here. The first question is, since the FDA granted MAPS, now Lykos, breakthrough status and was effectively riding shotgun. That's how I've been seeing it. Like, how are we to understand that the FDA like wasn't able to provide that level of guidance as it was looking so promising at first?
yeah, so it's not looking not promising. That was a very disappointing meeting. I think it really just highlights the knowledge gap, right? Which, as I've said to you before, is the federal government's fault. But I think it highlights that there is a knowledge gap, um, but it's not promising. I think it's actually, and Lycos released a very nice statement about it, communicating that this needs to be a partnership, which it really does. So I think what this tells us, if we want to look at it in a positive light, is that this now informs other companies as well as Lycos how to better design their clinical programs, and maybe some adverse events that we might be seeing that, maybe with changing a therapy protocol or something, we might be able to mitigate, like the suicidal ideology or ideation. But I mean, that's present in other marketed drugs, so I don't think that's the main holdup. But we also need to make sure we're not putting people into a procedure, giving them a medication who are vulnerable and susceptible to these thoughts already, that is going to largely accelerate that.
Mm-hmm. Um, and in your opinion, on like from a former insider's perspective, what does breakthrough status really mean? Like, what kind of involvement was really happening there, and like, what kind of guidance could FDA have provided with that kind of partnership?
Yeah, so the FDA, I believe, did provide like the appropriate guidance. So breakthrough therapy designation is basically, we see that there is an unmet medical need and that this product really could serve that need. So what we're going to do is, you're not going to get to cut any corners, but you're going to get priority. You're not going to be waiting as long. You're going to get more meetings with the agency. You're going to get more contact with the agency. We're working together to support your program, to like advance it a little more quickly. But at the end of the day, like, that safety still needs to be there and the data still needs to be there. And I think there were just some missing pieces that weren't there when the advisory panel met. But I think that should be a little bit better explained in the media, because it seems like, the FDA is saying no, and that's really not what's happening. And they're not, like I said, they're not beholden to that decision. They take it under advisement, but there's still time before the approval. I think it's coming up in August, is what I read.
That's what I'm told, like around 3 months out.
Yeah, so I don't think that's enough time to do a full blown trial, but maybe, I don't know, maybe there might be a mechanism at that level to get an extension and address some of their issues. I'm not positive. But yeah, breakthrough therapy designation just means that there's an unmet need. We recognize this is an unmet need, and we're going to provide you more support, to pull the program forward. The issue there is that the FDA admittedly is not expert in psychedelics. When they released the guidance, they did have a seminar discussing the guidance. And I think one of the first slides was like a mule sitting in a cart and a man pulling it. Like we have no idea what we're doing. So they are really trying to like work with companies to advance things. I will say an issue that we're running into, because psychedelics are so new in the regulatory agency, there isn't a whole bunch of historical data on these compounds. In the literature, there is some, and you can leverage that for investigational, like research INDs, where you're not trying to develop a product to use and to market. You're just trying to look at efficacy, and you want to use it in a human population. Those are wonderful. They expand our knowledge. They're, FDA vetted studies that are run in compliance with the FDA, which ultimately add to the data. But the strength comes from commercial programs, and there just are not a lot of those. So those are going to generate your full breadth of data that is needed for any new drug entering the market, from the non-clinical buildup to the chemistry, manufacturing, controls, clin farm, and then into clinical, and then even like labeling and all of the post things. It's really a huge group of experts that work on these products together on the agency side of things.
Mm-hmm. When do you think the last time a drug perplexed or class of drugs perplexed the FDA so much was? Do you think the mRNA
Cannabis
stuff, or like cannabis? Interesting.
Because cannabis ended up having a lot of, then all the CBDs came out, all the THCs came out. It wasn't just cannabis, then there's a botanical element to it. So they need to figure out how to safely move all of those forward. And when it's different products, like Delta 9 THC versus Delta 8 is very different. There's a lot of data to support the safety of Delta 9, whereas Delta 8, there were a lot of adverse events. It's not.
Was D8 the kind of like workaround molecule, or was that Delta? You remember, like, there was like a whole uptick in legal cannabis, and they were like selling Delta 8 or Delta 9. I forget which one it was.
Well, I think that uptick,
Delta 8's traditional THC. Is that right?
I think Delta 9 is traditional, and Delta
D9.
8 is the workaround, because there's
Right.
more information available on Delta 9 just publicly available. I'm not discussing anything proprietary. But even if you, for instance, are investigating Delta 9, and you want to add Delta 8, that's a whole separate application. That's not something that you can just add as like an add-on, like a little amendment, like try to sneak it in. Because they are so different, and we don't understand the safety of Delta 8. And this is all publicly available information. There were a lot of adverse events, including some deaths with Delta 8. So, and that's probably from like overconsumption, like.
Yeah. And I heard there was some really serious purity issues with a lot of that stuff. So God knows, right? We need a lot more data to say what it was.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably not it's probably a very low end dirty product that was overconsumed by somebody, and and who knows what their pre-existing conditions were or anything. So, but until those kind of things are sorted out and they get more data, they can't say definitively it's not Delta 8. The agency is very, very data driven.
Right. And was that, as far as you know, one of the first like whole plant products that was trying to get through the FDA? Cannabis?
I am not positive, but I know the botanical guidance is somewhat newer. I do know that even though there's an exemption for like dietary supplements, so the things that you would find at like a GNC, how they always say not FDA approved,
right?
Because they make the government so much money that there's actually a law that they don't have to go through the FDA. And a lot of those are plant-based. So until there's an extreme adverse event, they can't go through the FDA. The FDA has no like teeth to do that. So I know some of those products did end up going through the FDA. I don't know how synthesized they are, or if the botanical guidance would apply, because I didn't personally work with them. But yeah, it seems like cannabis, I would assume, is one of the first, but I can't speak to that factually.
Yeah. All good. All good. Yeah. Interestingly, one of my friends in the early, this is probably 2007-ish. Do you offhand know when Marinol came out, like was approved? Like it is like asking you all the historian questions. So one of my friends had cystic fibrosis. Her boyfriend at the time was my pot dealer. And she was prescribed Marinol. Like it was interesting to see like in the same household, Marinol and cannabis. And she was definitely consuming a lot more cannabis than Marinol to mitigate her symptoms. So very interesting. Was there anything else around that one? No, I remember being in Nashville just buying some like cheesy Delta 8 product off the street. I'm like, I guess I'll do this. It seems like a bad idea, but cool. And yeah, like that felt like such a weird transaction relative to what I'm used to here in Colorado, where there are some sort of safety standards.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, with legalization, like in the states that have it, there comes this large degree of safety because everybody in those communities like wants to maintain the integrity of those communities, and it doesn't hurt anybody to do it that way. I think the concern is that there's all of these cannabinoids and the THC molecules and the high purity, and we just don't know how all of like tweaking that just a little bit, can completely change something. And you're right, there are some sketchy products out there in states where it's not legal. Like you wouldn't run across that in Colorado, even in Montana, like you wouldn't run across it.
I feel like I'm getting off track from maps, but I have a couple of questions. I'll take these things down so we don't forget them. So, blinding, right? So they suggested a drug-only arm of the study would have been helpful. Like I recall Matthew Johnson on Twitter earlier today suggesting if or when unblinded, people healed just as much. Like there was a robust expectancy effect in the people who did not receive MDMA, which is super interesting. And is it just that the therapy they were doing was so good? Like I don't expect you to get that from like normal conventional like CBT therapy.
Yeah, I don't know if they were using an active placebo.
No active placebo as far as I know, like maybe a Benadryl.
I mean,
Benadryl seems to be the standard placebo pill.
it could be yeah, I mean it could just be the expectation. That's always something that's difficult to disentangle with any program that you're running, because people don't know what they're going in for. But it's particularly hard with psychedelics, and that's something that's also discussed in the draft guidance, is that a placebo is almost impossible because whether or not you're getting a dose of something that has psychoactive effects. Like so and the people watching so it's really difficult to blind these studies. So instead of a placebo, they've either suggested an active placebo or having a low, middle, high dose. So I would guess that a low dose would almost be like a micro dose where you're not getting the psychoactive effects, and then, mid and high to see, and that's how we conduct toxicology studies. But the 3 doses could tell you a little bit more about the contributions of the drug versus the therapy, which I thought was an interesting approach. And they're also kind of hammering home to maintain blindness, because unblinding, I think, was an issue with the MDMA, they said. So they're saying that even though the therapist should be able to tell the people monitoring the subjects after, or who are in the room, like when they're getting the drug, like they should use different staff across the board, and then not use that same staff to then score the videos after, or like analyze the data after, because they'll have that pre-existing, you'll have either the person who's like falling asleep from Benadryl or the person like listening to Pink Floyd having the time of their life. So they'll know.
Yeah. So I did a quick search. Sugar pill was a placebo. It looks like, according to a GPT, Google yielded nothing quickly for me. And so Yeah, it's a really interesting problem. I really want to dig into this placebo problem in psychedelic research a lot more. Yeah, like I don't think normal methodology works here. And it's probably a huge waste of the limited resources we have, and that we're trying to save a lot of lives here.
Yeah.
And like, do we really, like, is this really the move? So, all right, let's get a little critical. So like, I heard a lot of the critiques of MAPS Lykos through the years. Some of the biggest commentary getting thrown around by some of the critics was that this is a therapy cult. Do you think those critiques were taken seriously in any way? Did you not? You didn't see those critiques?
The FDA is not listening to that.
Yeah, as a data-driven organization, it doesn't seem like they could take that seriously, right?
No. People say wacky things about a lot of drugs. I mean, we lived through COVID. That's all I'll say. Like the agency just had to develop a vaccine and listen to all of that. So, I will say public concern for drugs, they would love to alleviate and explain and disseminate whatever information they can. And there are public portions of these advisory panels, sometimes where the public does get to like have their few minutes to discuss their concerns. And that's wonderful. The agency, doesn't want people uninformed about what they're taking. That's why the inserts in your medications are pages long that nobody bothers to read. So it's not that they're just dismissing those things, but these are definitely highly qualified, highly trained scientists who, yeah, they're not just going to be like, oh, people are saying it's a cult. Like, they're not interested in that. They see the benefit from the data, and that's what they'll drive forward with.
In terms of other critiques, what critiques do you think actually hurt this project that you're aware of?
Like from the advisory panel?
From this last meeting, like what did you observe that was stated as like really serious issues beyond what we've talked about with like blinding and like low, medium, high dosing, things like that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing was the clinical trial design, which I brought up. And there's not a big database of historical literature to go off of to support MDMA. Again, because it's a Schedule I drug and it's very difficult to do this research, and the government created its own problem there. But without information, we can only rely on what's presented in the package. And that just wasn't a strong enough study designed to move forward. I think that was like the biggest thing I took away from it. I didn't get a lot of, and I believe they mentioned it was like the inconsistency of people sticking with therapy, which I don't know how heavy that hit, but I don't really think that is a fair thing to throw in there, because that's the nature of psychiatric based illnesses, is that a lot of people don't stick with the therapy, and they if they're on consistent medication, they don't stick with that. So I think it's just more that we need to make these pieces fit better in the psychedelic model, and the agency wants to see that happen, and I think that they will be supportive of sponsors. And I do think that even though this was a disappointing outcome, it did shed light on things that we can do better as researchers, as developers, as regulators on this side of the table, to make sure that we're giving better information. And this wasn't like Lykos' fault. They're the first ones. So they just kind of got the short end of the stick, with what the FDA knew at the time and what's emerged since. So
earlier you said something about therapy. So what we did see, I believe, is that a lot of people stuck with therapy outside the scope of the trial, and that could have skewed results. And I remember Rick Doblin years ago saying, I don't know, maybe just the therapy is just that good that it's something about that therapy. But But I don't know, like what was your observation around that? Was it just like breaking the study a little bit that some people decided to go to therapy?
No, I mean, I don't even understand what the big hang up on understanding the contribution of therapy is, because that's the model. The model isn't just to give people these products and, go on your way and deal with it on your own. And I think it's so important because, like, in like PTSD, the nature of it is there's so much avoidance and so much fear and so much hesitation, and the MDMA is supposed to break those barriers down and like help people make it more effective. So maybe it's that people, even if they didn't get it, felt that sense of safeness a little bit more and were able to get to a comfortable enough place with therapy that they were then pursuing it on their own, instead of, going into it with like hesitation and fear, and then, they don't want to continue. So maybe even just the thought that something could be helping them break down those barriers the brain is, a really powerful thing. The power of thought helps.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
There
Um,
was one more I did just
mm-hmm.
remember. They were concerned about the safety of people leaving the program. So after you get your dose and you are, you're monitored the whole time, you're in a safe environment with medical staff present, etc. They said that it felt as if there was too much discretion left up to the therapist to release people, and they were worried because these are such long acting molecules, that people weren't ready to leave. So I think all that would require is like a more just like written out maybe criteria. And again, I'm not a clinician, I didn't see their protocol, but it sounded like they wanted like you need to check these boxes and have some sort of like maybe more extensive medical assessment before you left. Um, I did read a comment that it was up to the discretion of the therapist, which, like, of course, your doctor is the one that discharges you. So, since I didn't see the package, I obviously don't know where that disconnect is. But maybe there needs to be a more developed or like stricter criteria around that, like some sort of assessment that you pass, which I'm assuming the therapists do anyways. But maybe like they just needed to explain it better, or they needed to see that.
Huh. So around how this might go forward. So there's still a chance that the FDA could approve this thing. Some people are saying very strongly it's very likely to happen. Others are a little more cautious with their optimism. Um, yeah, can you speak to that? And also, like, say it gets rejected, is there a chance somebody like a J&J could rush to market and push a clinical trial through like super quickly and kind of displace Lykos here?
Um, so my experience with big pharma is they're not interested in this. Um, I haven't really heard of anybody like I don't think they see like the big economic gain that they would want. This isn't really their area of specialty. Those these companies more develop are like westernized medicine, whereas psychedelics are like the ancient medicine and the newer medicine. And I think you need a balance of understanding both. And
Mm-hmm.
I just don't I haven't seen something like J&J trying even having this on their radar.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I mean, I don't know everything going on in the world, but uh I don't think that would happen. I mean, I'm sure there are other psychedelic companies that are developing MDMA, just as there's a bunch, using psilocybin and LSD and mescaline. Um, so, I mean, I don't think we should look at it as like a race, but I think psilocybin was given breakthrough therapy designation too.
Yeah.
And that'll be the
I think
next
in a
one.
few categories as well,
Yeah.
which is
Um,
interesting.
I actually, so I'm not sure how this will turn out with MDMA. I know that, you know, MDMA is not your traditional like LSD, psilocybin, psychedelic. What did they call it? An enactogen.
And tactogen, like a, which is, I don't super love these words, I'm trying to beat around the bush. It's clearly not a classical psychedelic for sure.
How would you describe it? I used to think of it more as a euphoriant, but that might be
Uh,
inaccurate as well.
I try to get like vague. I say things like, this is a, um, an interesting amphetamine that can, on occasion, instantiate psychedelic experiences, but that misses the whole like heart touchy aspect of it, and the comfort and the less fear, all those kind of things. Like it misses that. So I don't have a great one. Intactogen might be the best one, but I don't know. I I think there's the touchiness, there's the dance, the movement, there's the lack of fear, there's the uh, not exactly this, but something approximating unconditional positive regard. It's a complicated molecule
Yeah.
to talk about, but aren't they all?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, sitting in meetings and, you know, the language that has been adopted is mystical experience because that's what it is. So when you're describing the benefits of psychedelics, like I remember my supervisor asking me like, so like what is hypothetically what is tripping? Like what is a mystical experience? Because you know, federal employees can, it's a no-no. You could have never done it. Um but I was explaining, you know, the value of what a mystical experience is, and you know, even people outside of like the agency, just the general public who, you know, was poisoned by the drug war. Um, they have this mentality about psychedelics, and I've had to explain like it's not like being drunk where you're blacking out and completely out of control of your behavior. It's actually this really beautiful thing that you hold to be your highest truth when you like reach those mystical experiences and you are able to process things just with this sort of like veil lifted from your brain, like in a different way. And you feel this strong connectedness to like the people around you and the universe and nature. And it's a very healing experience. It's not, you know, in the same vein of like drinking to the point that you're literally poisoning yourself until you throw up. Like that is different. So I think it's really important for us to keep talking about these things more in like a medicinal conversation, especially, you know, with people not from the community or, you know, with the agency to spread awareness. If they hear about it as medicine, I think it clicks a little bit more. Um, like I always say, you know, most of the people who like have these concerns, they're heavy drinkers or like, you know, you taught me about David Nutt's harm reduction scale. I believe that's the name. And that's so accurate. You know, most of, I think without giving anything away, most of the applications I saw were to treat alcohol use disorder. And so I always say, like, what you're demonizing me for, like, my plant, like, treats your addiction. Like,
Exactly. It's really it's troubling, but it's the unfortunate global scenario we have to deal with, right? Imagine if our recreational substances didn't harm us as much as alcohol does.
right?
Yeah, one of my favorite lines is, "This is touchy, but alcohol has hurt my family almost as much as the Catholic Church has," and like I kind of stand by that. Being from New England,
Yeah. I'm
Catholic
from New
Church
England
wasn't
too.
super behaving, so yeah, and tobacco and alcohol scored the most harmful on that David Nutt scale. LSD, psilocybin, among the top three safest. I forget what the first most safe one was, like buprenorphine or something goofy that didn't really seem to belong. Yeah, and then like MDMA and cannabis are somewhere in the middle. And yeah, David Nutt's categorical statement a while back, we should immediately be decriminalizing anything safer than alcohol and working towards understanding the rest of them. And that's a cautious statement. I think we need to get rid of the drug war writ large, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. Um,
Common theme.
have you have you heard of anything that could evolve this kind of expensive and perhaps not the most efficient method, the RCT? Like RCT is amazing, placebo-controlled RCTs, like they get great certainty to a degree. Like it's never perfect because there's always a statistical component when we start getting like 20,000 people using. But like, is there something that people are looking at as more cost effective? So it could be like a dose range thing. I recall talking to a kind of a FEMA type, like he does a lot of FEMA prep for disaster. And he proposed a study where, and this is just an example, but he was using meditation as the example. Cool. We want to like understand meditation, relatively worthy thing to study. Why don't we, instead of just saying placebo group and random meditation method, we do maybe, 8 people in a placebo group, and then we do 8 people across a bunch of different, maybe 14 people. I heard there's some magic at 14 statistically, across different meditation methods from around the world. And that way we have a far more robust data set for a study we're already doing. I know funding is always going to be a problem for stuff like this, but we're here to understand this stuff, not necessarily to make a product to sell. This is like the complex part about science. We have the harm reduction part, then we have the productization part, which is 2 very different conversations, especially as it relates to medicine.
Yeah. So I can say that, so dose range finding studies are part of investigational, like an IND. You do those. So I guess should I just explain kind of like some of the things that go into early
Sure.
drug development? Because,
Please.
yeah, like I've said, the FDA is,
Not everybody knows.
yeah. And all of this is publicly available, and I'd be happy to like send links to direct people if they're interested. It's it's a long read because it's guidance after guidance, but they lay everything out. So when you're coming in with a new drug, you have your proposal, and usually have a pre-meeting to see like what your package is going to need. And this is a multidisciplinary effort. Like I said, there's non-clinical chemistry, clinical staff. If you're a plant, if you fit the criteria to be in the botanical guidance, there's like botanical people that are on the committee. There's clinical pharmacologists. So we're all getting together and we're deciding what the pieces need to be. So when you come in and you start with your non-clinical program, this is the data and the experiments that are ultimately going to inform what dose you can use in humans, what's safe, what they need to monitor for. So you should already have a strong idea of what your clinical protocol is, because your non-clinical studies need to support your clinical studies. So non-clinical just refers to animal work. And for new products, you need to do this in a rodent and a non-rodent. So your big studies, your pivotal studies, are going to be what's called good laboratory practice compliant. So these are like the big ones, that these are the data sets that matter. These are the ones that are heavily getting judged because these are run, prim, proper, perfect, as perfect as science could get. But before those, you have dose range finding studies, because in your pivotal study, we need to see 3 different doses, because we want to see the toxicology of the drug. So you're looking for what's called a NOEL, so a no observable adverse effect level. If you don't have one, it's called a LOEL, so the lowest dose that didn't have adverse events. So that's how we're judging safety, based off of your toxicology, your pharmacology, your safety pharmacology. So you have to evaluate like CNS, respiratory, cardiac. There's a set of studies for each. You eventually have to do mutagenicity, which there are some in silico programs that you can leverage if it's a non-mutagenic compound and there's enough data to support that. And then you have to do like your PK studies. So we need to see how the drug is acting in different species. We need to look at the
PK being pharmacokinetic.
yeah, sorry,
Right.
alphabet soup.
Oh, good. I get it.
Yep. So we're looking at, how fast is this peaking in the body? How long is it sustained in the body? Also, ADME studies, so excretion, absorption, distribution, and metabolism. You want to see if there's specific human metabolites. That's something we have to keep an eye on. So you're getting this really full breadth of how this drug is working in the body. You're understanding the pharmacology and toxicology, and then based on those findings, you select your human dose. Then the FDA reviews it, and they either confirm or they select your human dose. And then there's some math that you do to show what like a rat dose would be in a human.
Mm.
So then based on those data, and that should mirror your clinical protocol. So you should be giving this the same way that you would be giving it to a human, the same frequency. And they really delineate like the length and duration of the studies, the recovery groups, what endpoints need to be examined, etc. So based on your non-clinical package and those data, then you move forward into your clinical. So a lot of the dose range finding studies, things like that, are done before your pivotal studies to make sure that those are very solid when you submit them.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Yeah, that's really helpful. And yeah, the phase 0 stuff into, just when you start introducing into humans, it's so wild. I wonder, does the FDA see things that humans have been using for a long time any differently? Like, for instance, cannabis or various, South American plant products that we want to productize via an FDA path, or
Yeah,
how do
so
you think
if
about that?
you are a researcher and you're not trying to develop this for a human population, you can leverage existing historical data. The FDA is not blind to the fact that there are multi generations of deadheads out there who don't have tentacles and have like beautiful, like kids, grandkids, super healthy. You know, they know that these things have been used forever and they can see that, but that's anecdotal. They need the actual data, and it has to, for a product being developed for commercial use, it has to basically be that like GLP compliant study, because that's how we standardize, well, that's how the agency makes it fair for everybody. Everybody has to meet these same marks. For certain things, there are waivers that you can apply for, not for like your like big toxicology studies, but do we need to look at this in a pediatric population? No, we never intend to use this in a pediatric population. So, there are some studies that you can apply for waivers for. Every program is not a cookie cutter. Every drug is going to be different, but they really care about setting a standard, because also then if anything wonky comes out, you have sort of a historical data set to look at, but also we know moving forward, like, oh, hey, maybe in this class of drug, we should be looking at this. Or, maybe since all these studies are coming out the same, we maybe don't need to have this requirement anymore.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is a lot of this around like not just safety, but like litigation? Like, are people kind of worried about getting sued in the agency?
Um, it's not like we're sitting there doing like people aren't sitting there like shaking doing their jobs. Every single thing that we communicate to a sponsor, to the public, was vetted through legal. We have to take writing courses when we start to understand the language that's used at the FDA. And when you're constructing a response, what you can and cannot say, because there are some things that are a suggestion, but like the word must was like a big one. Like we weren't allowed to say you must do this unless it was like something you actually had to do. But it's
Mm-hmm.
all vetted through legal, and then those responses are pretty much standardized for like each drug class. Like say you had a buprenorphine application, and we have 6 other ones. you're all literally going to get essentially the same response, because we want to make sure that it's standard, for the same question, um, it needs to be standard because, sponsors talk, and if they're giving inconsistent advice, like, that doesn't benefit anybody.
Right. Absolutely. It gets really complicated.
But they
So,
absolutely can be sued. Um, and I think more than anything, it's not a fear of loss. Like, these scientists, honestly, like, just, I worked with such wonderful people, and like all of the different disciplines I interacted with, it really is just people who are passionate about their job. They're highly qualified scientists. They're some of the smartest people that I've met, and they really, really just care about the safety of the products, and they're using the tools that the FDA is designed to ensure that.
cool. Um, so two products that I'm really interested in, cannabis and ketamine. The ketamine conversation in the psychedelic space is it's really interesting, and it seems to have bred some discontent, malcontent around drug approval process, right? And like expense, insurance coverage, right? So like downstream of FDA approval is a whole set of things, right? The FDA approved ketamine as an anesthetic, largely around surgical stuff. You can sometimes get approval for pain conditions, but therapists are seeing it be very effective and helpful in therapy. And like, is there a pathway? Like, do you think it likely that some group, be it a nonprofit or otherwise, would come through and try to get this approved for depression, for instance, a psychiatric indication?
I'd be shocked if it wasn't already within the appropriate division.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I love that.
Yeah, I'd honestly be shocked if it's not in there. Um,
And is there a lot of cost savings as a result of it already being approved for a different indication?
yeah, so if they have like a whole, which like ketamine obviously would have a whole historical data set. These are things that the FDA has access to, but they can't just dig in. It's called a drug master file. They can't just dig into that. They need, if you want to leverage that data, again, you have to get the written consent from the company to access that data and leverage it for your application. Um, I've never really seen a hang up with this. I'm sure historically there has been one, but since the company owns those data, you got to get permission. And when we have the signed letter from them, then we can go and access those data, and you can leverage, whatever you need to. Um, like, as long as you have permission, but like, the non-clinical work. Do we really need to run more toxicology studies on ketamine? If you're using it within the dose and it's the form and route of administration, then no. And you would just have to approve efficacy for your indication, which would likely just be your clinical trials. You could
Mm-hmm.
leverage the historical data, and those are called 505(b)(2) applications, where you're going in with an existing product and you're trying to change like dosage form or indication, things like, or develop a generic. So it's different requirements. You don't have to do the full battery. Um,
Right.
yeah.
Interesting. Um, huh. Any thoughts on this whole like J&J Spravato topic, or like, hey, we have this Spravato being like a filtered ketamine. It's like just only the left-handed molecules or something like that, left or right hand, one of them. They filtered out half of them and said, "Oh, new drug here, works great on depression." But it's effectively ketamine, and the data all says that too. But it's treated differently, which is fascinating. And I see similar things happening sometimes around psilocybin. We're like, oh yeah, we have our own form of psilocybin. It's like, what does that even mean? Like, just because it shows up when it crystallizes in a certain shape, like that counts? Or how do you know what I'm talking about there?
Yeah, vaguely. I don't know the whole story of what you're saying, but just
Mm-hmm.
biochemically, yeah, if you're changing the molecule, like, it could act differently in the body. Like, this. like delta 9, delta 8, both THCs, but very different. So small molecular differences or like a higher purity, like these are going to interact in the body differently. It can change how it's metabolized. It can change the pharmacokinetics. It can change the adverse events that you see. So yeah, if it's a different molecule, it's a different drug.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And different molecule could mean certain crystalline forms
It
of
could have different
molecule.
binding affinity. It could,
Right. Right. And it requires all that data for us to like get any
yeah.
sense of certainty, right?
So it just seems like super straightforward, but if you really get into the nitty gritty of it and think about it, like it could really vastly change things, or it could not change anything, but we do need to know that. So
right on. Cool. Well, did we miss anything? Is there anything super important for us to get into as we close up, like projects you're attached to that you want to talk about?
I'm not even really sure what I'm allowed to talk about, so I'm just gonna leave that ended. But I definitely would like I love being in this space, and I think I'm in a really unique position having experience within the agency and then leaving. So if anybody does have any regulatory questions, they can feel free to contact me.
Outstanding.
I really am passionate about helping move this field forward and being a bridge between both, and I have pretty good experience to do that. So yeah, thank you for having this conversation. I think it's really important for us to keep, this knowledge flowing between both sides of the table.
Agreed. Yeah, endlessly important. All right, Amanda, Holley, thanks so much, and I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. This was awesome.